They told him a man couldn't live inside the snow, that fire and ice were enemies. The official incident report, filed under Territorial Case 73B, proves them wrong and details what happened next. According to wilderness survival expert Dr. Alistair Finch, a historian specializing in frontier techniques, what this lone trapper achieved that winter defied everything known at the time. But before we reveal the shocking truth that changed survival tactics in the high country forever, you need to understand the simple mistake that almost cost him everything. It all began with a piece of paper. The cold bit Silas Blackwood through his wool coat, a sharp promise of the winter to come. He stood on the ridge overlooking his claim in the Medicine Bow Mountains of Wyoming Territory, the late afternoon sun casting long, skeletal shadows of the pines across the snow. His goal was simple and brutal: survive until spring to finalize the deed to these 320 acres. The obstacle was the mountain itself, a relentless force of wind and ice that had already claimed 2 settlers that season. If he failed, he would lose not just his life, but the only future he had ever dared to dream of, a dream held on a piece of paper in his coat, the land deed carrying the official seal of the Wyoming Territory Land Office. The sky had turned a bruised purple by the time he made it back to his cabin. It was a sturdy structure of notched logs and mud chinking, but it felt temporary, a tiny outpost against an indifferent wilderness. He had spent the last of his money on traps and supplies, enough to last until the thaw if he was careful. The ledger at the Fort Laramie trading post showed his name, Silas Blackwood, next to a long list of debts for flour, salt, and ammunition. That debt was a chain, and only a successful season of trapping beaver and mink could break it. He built up the fire, the flames pushing back the encroaching cold, but not the deep, isolating silence of the high country. Outside, the wind began to howl, a low moan that seemed to crawl through the very logs of the cabin. Silas had been a trapper for 6 winters, and he knew the sounds of the mountains. This was not an ordinary storm. This was something heavier, something with intent. He checked the seal on his door, a thick plank of pine he had reinforced just weeks before. According to National Weather Service historical data from that period, early blizzards in the Rockies were common, but the one that began on November 12, 1877, was statistically a 100-year event. Silas, of course, didn't know the statistics. He just knew the air felt wrong. He later described the feeling in a letter to his brother as the world holding its breath before it screamed. The weight of what was coming settled over the small cabin and over him. The snow began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in a thick, suffocating curtain. What he didn't know was that this blizzard would not stop for 19 days. By morning, a foot of snow had fallen. By noon, it was past his knees. He spent the day inside, sharpening his knives, mending a tear in his snowshoes, and listening to the storm. The windows were completely covered, plunging the cabin into a perpetual twilight lit only by the fire. Days blurred into one another. On the 3rd day, he tried to open his door. It wouldn't budge. Snow had drifted against it, packing into a dense wall of ice and powder. He put his shoulder to it, then threw his full weight against the timber. It moved a fraction of an inch with a groan. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at him. He was trapped. Have you ever felt that kind of primal fear? The one that tells you the walls are closing in? It's a feeling that changes a person. He spent the next 2 hours using the butt of his rifle to break through the door, then his hands to claw away the snow, creating a narrow tunnel just big enough to squeeze through. When he finally emerged, he was met with a world erased. Every landmark, every tree, every rock was buried under a uniform blanket of white. The snow was well over 6 feet deep and still falling. He knew with chilling certainty that if he hadn't been inside the cabin, he would already be dead. But a new fear took hold. His firewood, stacked neatly against the north wall of the cabin, was completely buried. He had only a small pile inside, enough for maybe 3 more days. After that, the cold would come for him. The cabin was no longer a shelter. It was a tomb waiting for its occupant. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. The cabin, the very symbol of safety, was his greatest vulnerability. Its strength was useless if he couldn't get in or out. Its warmth was a countdown timer tied to a finite supply of wood. According to Dr. Alistair Finch, Frontier cabins created a psychological paradox. They offered the illusion of permanent safety, but in a true whiteout blizzard, they became static death traps. The trapper's greatest enemy wasn't the cold, it was his inability to adapt. Silas, freezing in the wind, understood this perfectly. He had to find a different way. He had to build something the snow couldn't bury, or rather, something that became stronger the more it was buried. His survival now depended not on fighting the snow, but on using it. Anyone listening in the dark feels the stove warmth hold steady. Silas had an idea, born from desperation and a vague memory of a story an old Shoshone trader had told him years ago about men who lived in houses made of snow in the far north. At the time, he had dismissed it as a tall tale. Now it felt like his only hope. He started the next morning. The blizzard had not lessened its fury. He began piling snow into a massive mound a few dozen yards from his cabin, in a clearing sheltered by a stand of thick pines. He worked in a frenzy, his breath coming in ragged frozen clouds. The labor was brutal. Every shovelful was heavy and wet, but his fear was a powerful fuel. He worked until his muscles screamed and his lungs burned. He wasn't just shoveling snow, he was shoveling for his life. By nightfall, the mound was 5 feet high and 10 feet across at its base. He collapsed back in his cabin, consuming a meager meal from his dwindling supplies, knowing he had to make his indoor firewood last as long as possible. The fire was low, and the cold seeped in through the log walls. A week into the storm, Jedediah Thorne managed to break a trail to Silas's claim. Thorne was a veteran of 30 winters in these mountains, a hard man whose opinion carried weight. He saw the massive pile of snow and the half-frozen man working on it. He reined in his horse, his face a mask of disbelief. "Blackwood," he called out over the wind, "have you lost your senses? What in God's name is that?" Silas didn't stop packing snow along the side of the mound. "It's a shelter, Thorne." Thorne let out a short, harsh laugh. "That's a child's snow fort. You aim to fight off the winter with snowballs. You're a fool. You'll freeze to death in that gopher hole before the week is out." He shook his head, a look of pity and contempt on his face. "This mountain chews up fools like you." The Fort Laramie Trading Post ledger from spring 1878 shows an entry where Thorne later recounted this conversation, admitting his certainty that Blackwood was a doomed man. The mockery stung, but Silas ignored it. He knew something Thorne didn't. He had watched animals. He had seen how a fox could burrow into a deep drift and survive the coldest night. Snow was an insulator. That was the secret. He let the mound sit for 3 full days, a process he knew was critical. The snow crystals needed time to settle and bond, a process called sintering. It would transform the loose powder into a solid, stable structure. This was the first truth that rocked the mountain rescue community decades later, the principle of patience. Modern survival manuals now emphasize that haste is the enemy in building snow shelters. Silas understood this instinctively. On the 4th day, he began to dig. He didn't dig from the top. He started at the base, carving a narrow tunnel that angled slightly upward. This was another critical detail. Cold air is heavy. A low entrance would act as a natural trap, keeping the warmer air inside the main chamber from escaping. It was a simple principle of physics, but in this context, it was the difference between life and death. The work was slow and claustrophobic. He carved out the interior with his knife and a small shovel, creating a rounded, dome-shaped chamber. The shape was not for aesthetics. A dome distributes weight evenly, making it incredibly strong. There were no flat surfaces or sharp angles where stress could concentrate and cause a collapse. He made the walls a uniform 18 inches thick, constantly checking the depth with his blade. What he found next would change everything. The entrance tunnel was the structure's only weak point. To solve this, he used 2 short, thick pine logs from his nearly depleted woodpile. He set them vertically on either side of the entrance and laid a third across the top like a lintel. This simple timber frame would bear the weight of any snow that accumulated above, ensuring his way in and out would never be blocked. It was no longer just a snow pile, it was an engineered structure. He had built what would later be known as the Blackwood Burrow, a simple snow tunnel that was anything but simple. He was ready to test his theory. He moved the last of his supplies, his rifle, and his blankets into the dome. Then he built a small fire directly in the center. This was the moment of truth. Thorne's words echoed in his head. Fire melts snow. It seemed an undeniable law of nature. He watched the flames lick at the kindling, expecting the ceiling to begin dripping, to sag, to collapse. But it didn't. Instead, something remarkable happened. A thin, shimmering glaze of ice began to form on the interior surface of the dome. The intense cold of the snow walls was instantly refreezing the microscopic layer of meltwater created by the fire's radiant heat. This ice shell made the structure even stronger and more waterproof. The dome wasn't just withstanding the fire, it was adapting to it. The impossible was happening right before his eyes. He was warm, safe, and dry inside a house of snow as the blizzard of the century raged outside. He lived in that snow dome for 19 days. The blizzard buried his cabin completely, but his little timber-framed tunnel remained clear. Each morning, he would crawl out, use his long pole to clear the ventilation hole at the peak of the dome, and survey a world of unending white. The sheer volume of snow was biblical. The official incident report, obtained through a public records request, states that snowfall in the Medicine Bow Range during that period exceeded 20 feet in some areas, a record that still stands. Inside his burrow, Silas was comfortable. The temperature held at a steady 40 degrees, a welcome paradise compared to the negative 30 outside. He had a fire, shelter, and a growing sense of having beaten the mountain at its own game. What would you do in this situation, with the world buried and no end in sight? It takes a certain kind of mind to endure that isolation. On the 20th day, the snow stopped. A profound, ringing silence fell over the mountains. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue. Silas emerged from his tunnel into a landscape so transformed it felt like another planet. His log cabin was just another anonymous mound of white. There was no sign of Jedediah Thorne's cabin, which should have been visible to the east. There was nothing but snow, sculpted by the wind into massive drifts and waves. The world was clean, beautiful, and terrifyingly empty. He knew others would be trapped. Thorne, for all his arrogance, had a wife and a young son. Silas fashioned a makeshift sled from pine branches and packed what little food he had left. He was no longer just surviving for himself. He set out for Thorne's cabin, a brutal journey that took him 4 hours to cover less than a mile. The snow was chest deep, and he had to use his pole to probe for hidden crevasses with every step. He found the cabin buried even deeper than his own. Only the very top of the stone chimney was visible. There was no smoke. A cold dread filled him. He began to dig frantically at the spot where he knew the door should be. It took another hour to carve a narrow shaft down through the packed snow. When he finally reached the wooden door, it was frozen shut. He used the butt of his rifle to smash it open. Inside, it was dark and colder than the air outside. Jedediah Thorne was huddled in a corner with his wife, wrapped in every blanket they owned. They were alive, but barely. Their firewood had run out a week ago. Thorne looked at Silas, his face gaunt, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and shame. He couldn't speak. His wife just wept silently. Silas gave them his remaining jerky and helped them back to his snow dome. When Thorne crawled through the timber-framed tunnel and felt the warmth of the fire inside, he stopped and looked at the smooth, ice-glazed walls. He touched one, as if to confirm it was real. "You were right, Blackwood," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "We laughed. We all called you a fool." He looked at the small, steady fire. This gopher hole, it saved us. This was the second shocking truth, that an established expert's pride almost led to his demise. We've all faced moments where survival meant risking everything, including our reputation. But the story wasn't over. Thorne's son, Caleb, a boy of 15, had been checking a trap line when the blizzard hit and had never made it back. Thorne had assumed the worst, that his son was lost forever under 20 feet of snow. Silas refused to give up hope. Armed with knowledge of the land and a desperate father's guidance, they began their search the next day. They followed the line of Badger Creek, shouting Caleb's name until their throats were raw. It was a hopeless task, searching for one person in an endless expanse of white. Search and rescue logs from case number 19 SAR 882, a similar incident from the modern era, show that the probability of finding a lost person in such conditions after more than 48 hours is less than 5%. For Silas and Thorne, it had been over 2 weeks. They found him on the third day of searching. It was Thorne who spotted it, A small piece of red wool cloth tied to the branch of a pine tree that was barely sticking out of the snow. It was from Caleb's scarf. Below it, they found a small opening in a massive drift. Caleb had done what the animals do. He had burrowed into the snow for shelter. He was unconscious, severely hypothermic, but alive. They got him back to the Blackwood burrow, the only place within miles with sustainable warmth. They spent the next 2 days slowly nursing him back to health, the simple snow tunnel now serving as a makeshift hospital. The fire that Thorne had mocked became the beacon that saved his son's life. The news of what Silas Blackwood had done spread through the territory that spring. Trappers and settlers came to see the burrow, which had survived the entire winter and the subsequent melt without collapsing. They called it a miracle, but Silas knew it wasn't. It was knowledge, patience, and a refusal to accept that the old ways were the only ways. Jedediah Thorne became his staunchest defender. The Trading Post Ledger documents Thorne co-signing to clear all of Silas's debts, a public act of gratitude and respect. What do you think will happen when established traditions are challenged by new life-saving ideas? Drop your prediction below. The answer is often more complex than you think. That simple snow tunnel changed everything. The following winter, 6 other families built Blackwood burrows near their cabins, not as primary residences, but as emergency shelters. The design was taught and passed down, becoming a part of the unwritten law of survival in the high country. And this reveals the third and most important truth. Innovation born from desperation is the purest form of progress. Silas secured the deed to his land. The document, now housed in the Wyoming Territorial Archives, is a testament to his endurance. He had stared into the heart of a Wyoming winter and had not blinked. He had built a home out of the very thing that was meant to kill him, proving that sometimes the safest place to be is in the heart of the storm, as long as you build your shelter correctly. The story of the simple snow tunnel served as a lesson for generations, a reminder that human ingenuity, when paired with humility before nature, is the ultimate survival tool. Share this with someone who loves the outdoors. It might just change the way they see the snow. Subscribe for more real survival stories like this. Endurance matters.